4:29, so we'll give them 1 minute. Start. Okay, 4:30. Okay, free riders or anybody's got questions? Who's got questions? Okay, ready to start.
So, since it was so long ago, I was wondering if you could give like a little bit of lecture on the science of the slave, the state of back in first principles.
So the question of the slave and the state of nature. So those are two different questions, right?
Right.
Sorry, somebody's wants captions. Okay, hope captions work. Okay, so the first is from Aristotle, right? Slavery was discussed at length in Aristotle's Politics. He asked the question, does slavery exist by nature, right? Presumably, it exists by nature. It's just or not unjust. If it does not, well, then that's more in question, right? And Aristotle says, well, it's sort of a hard answer. Most slavery seems to be by convention, people who are conquered in war and taken into slavery. But he does say there seems to be a human type who's not able to care for himself or herself, who just can't act without direction. And if there's a slave by nature, that's the kind of person it would be, someone who needs to be told what to do all the time. But here's the problem with that. That's actually not going to be a very useful slave, right? Certainly wouldn't be useful as an employee in a business. You want to train somebody and tell them, okay, cook dinner or whatever it is, and they don't have to be told, okay, take this pan down, put water in the pan, take this out of the refrigerator. I mean, that would be it would hardly be worth it at some level if you had to have that. So that raises the question of whether there really is a slave by nature. Yes, is there a science of slavery? Is that the particular question you're asking? And that had to do with things like, I suppose, the art of cooking or the kinds of things that one might be able to give someone who's enslaved in order to do. But if that person has an art or a science, then presumably they know how to do things. And then it wouldn't be just for them to be a slave, because Aristotle says the natural slave would differ as much from the natural master as the body from the soul. But everybody has a body, right? So even every master has a body, and anyone who's enslaved would have a soul. So that again suggests he knows the argument's kind of problematic here, and maybe doesn't seriously, but he knows there's conventional slavery in Greece at the time. I mean, there's no question about that. And he's not an abolitionist. He's not the kind of person who would even say, if slavery is unjust, it has to be abolished now, because I think he recognizes that everything in politics is kind of a compromise with reality, and you can't expect perfection in practical life. What else on that? I mean, there's lots more that could be said about it, but maybe that touches the main points. He does say this, that someone who can be enslaved maybe is a natural slave. That is someone who doesn't fight back against it. Because it seems that if you resist being enslaved, probably you have what it takes to rule yourself, at least the desire. And that's a part of it. It seems to matter to have the desire as well as the intelligence. Well, the soul involves both the desire and the intelligence, right? The spiritedness and the intelligence. But conventional slavery, he acknowledges exists in his world, and moreover, he even suggests it exists in the best regime. I guess remember in the discussion of the best regime in Book 7, he mentions at one point that you could offer emancipation as a reward to your slave. Well, you can't emancipate a natural slave. That's someone who can't be anything else except a slave. So if you emancipated them, they'd starve or something like that. So So it must be that there's conventional slavery that is by law, but not by nature, even in the best regime. Now, the state of nature is discussed by Thomas Hobbes, right? Most especially. It's discussed by Locke, but not in the part that you read. Discussed by Hobbes, state of nature is the situation of human beings living together without government. That's what defines it. But in fact, says Hobbes, the state of nature will be a war of everyone against everyone, because there are different sources of conflict among human beings. Partly they're just in competition for things. Partly they anticipate that they'll be in competition for things. So even if they're not in competition now, maybe they will be tomorrow. So they might try to get an advantage ahead of time, anticipate, says. And then there's some people who are just proud, and they want people to respect them and look up to them or acknowledge that they're better, even if there's no competition for material goods or other goods. And he says these are the three conflicts, and they ensure that human beings without a ruler will maybe not be fighting all the time, but always be on the edge of fight, right? Remember, he says it's state of war is like foul weather. Doesn't have to be pouring down rain. It's just that you get the sense it could rain any moment. And so that's this state of nature is this situation where conflict could erupt at any time. But if you have sovereign, right, if there is a ruler, a common power over you, then you can expect that that sovereign's going to keep the peace, because if anybody gets out of line, the sovereign's going to straighten them out right away. So state of nature, condition of man without sovereignty, and that is for Hobbes a state of war. It's going to collapse into a state of war. And that's why a sovereign is necessary, because this state of war is just intolerable. Nobody wants to live. Nobody wants to live there. See, part of the cause of the state of nature is we don't agree about what's good. Right? If we all agreed about what's good and what's just, presumably we could live together in harmony, but people don't. They have all sorts of different ideas about what's good. They have different desires and so different ideas about what's good. So I guess they compete only if the goods overlap, but they don't always overlap, and they compete about what they ought to compete about, I guess. So they could dispute that. Human beings can find all sorts of reasons to fight. You sort of know that, right? So, and that's Hobbes's point. If you just look at human nature, you realize human beings can find all sorts of reasons to be in conflict with one another. And the danger is that those conflicts will turn deadly. And nobody wants to live like that. And that's the one thing everybody can agree on, that the life in the state of nature is intolerable and you have to get out. How do you get out of the state of nature? Hobbes has an answer. You create a sovereign. That's his theory in a nutshell. Good. You had a question back behind. Are you sure? Okay. Okay. Someone else. Jerry, go ahead.
I just wanted, what is the basis behind William Brennan's activist living constitution? Because I read William Brennan's
Speech or article, yeah.
I don't feel like I understand his justification behind the way that he's used this.
So Brennan's argument is the Constitution was written a long time ago. It has some general principles, above all, the principle of respecting human dignity, that are implicit in all of its particular terms. And when there is a passage of the Constitution that's hard to interpret, you want to interpret it in light of the meaning of our understanding of human dignity now, and of how we live now. Now, partly that's because of changes to the Constitution, but partly it might be due to other historical changes in human understanding. And so he thinks that if, it's no problem the clauses that are completely specific and don't really take interpretation, right? You have to be 35 years old to be the president, right? You have to have been a natural born citizen. Well, you have to figure out what natural born means, but that actually is a term of art that was in the law. So he may not raise a question about it. But the 35 years, no question about it, I suppose. And the fact that both houses have to pass a bill for it to become a law, and then the president either signs it or vetoes it. And if he vetoes it, he sends it back to the House with his reasons. And they have, 10 days, Sundays excluded, to return the bill. Well, I mean, that's not too complicated. There might be some time an issue would be raised, but on the whole, that's pretty clear. But what is due process of law, right? Life, you can't deprive anyone of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Well, what are your liberties that are covered by that? That's pretty general, is the argument. Or no state can deprive any person, says the 14th Amendment, of equal protection of the laws. Well, what is equal protection of the laws? That's pretty general. Well, how do judges interpret terms like that? They look at precedents. They look at how they've been interpreted before. But precedent can itself develop over time. And judges take a slightly different view of things because things have changed, right? So to take an example, this is actually an issue that Brennan decided important cases concerning. Does equal protection of the law mean that the law must treat men and women the same, exactly the same? Well, it's pretty clear that it couldn't have meant that when the law was passed, when the 14th Amendment was passed in 1868, because no state at that time gave women the right to vote. Some states still had limits on women's capacity to own property in their own name if they were married. And there were other restrictions or differences in the way the laws treated men and women. Typically, for example, if the law established an age after which you could marry without your parents' consent, sometimes it was higher for men than for women. There were drinking age laws, used to be higher for men than for women. When I think so, but yeah, I think so. It was 21 for boys and 18 for girls. And there are differences. I mean, these differences were all through the law in different states. And so you couldn't say on the original intent that equal protection meant you had to make exactly the same rules for men and for women. It meant you had to treat all men the same, you had to treat all women the same. But the distinction between men and women was allowed in the law. In the same way, does equal protection mean you have to treat grown-ups and children the same? Well, no, the law always made distinctions about when you come into maturity. And sometimes the age was 21, and sometimes it was 18, and sometimes it was 21 for men and 18 for women. And, you know, or what is it? I think marriage law at some point, maybe still today, you could get married at 18 without your parents' consent, and at 16 with your parents' consent. Might vary state to state, it does vary state to state, and that sort of thing. So equal protection of the law doesn't mean you can't distinguish on the basis of age. Do you have to charge everyone the same rate for taxes, or can you charge people a higher rate if they earn more? A higher rate, not just that they pay, more money, but that they actually pay at a higher rate if they earn more. Is that a denial of equal protection of the laws? Well, no, the courts have never said it is, right? They've allowed what's called a graduated income tax. So even though in principle you could say, well, everybody agrees with equal protection of laws, the question is, what distinctions can the laws make? So with regard to the difference between the sexes, nobody ever claimed that, successfully claimed, they claimed, but nobody successfully claimed that the law, equal protection of the laws, protects against any differentiation between the sexes until the 1960s. Now, before that, the Constitution was amended to say you can't deny women the right to vote. That was way back in 1920, the 19th Amendment, right, to the Constitution. But presumably, they figured that women now have the right to vote. So if they want to change those laws that differentiate, they can elect people to change those laws, right? But women might want special protection of the law, or they might want to drink when they're younger than the men do, right? Because they had to mature a little young. Well, maybe this isn't true today, but it used to be true, and probably all of you know it's kind of true that girls tend to grow up a little faster than the guys, probably because at a certain right? Maybe I should say that because people won't admit them out loud. So at a certain age, women are vulnerable in ways that men are never going to be vulnerable. And it takes a long time for men to understand that. And now science shows that the male brain doesn't mature until later, right? They've got some kind of scientific study on that, which just confirms what, as it were, everybody knew. But see, that would be the argument that you could change the Constitution on that, but no one thought the Equal Protection Clause applied to the Constitution. But in the 1960s, the court decided, actually, it's 1971, the issue comes up in the 60s, and in the 60s, they say, there's a case that says, well, no, you can't exclude women from juries. It used to be that just women. You ever seen the movie 12 Angry Men? It's about a jury. Why is it 12 men? Did you wonder that? Well, because this is the 1940s. Henry Fonda's in the movie. I think it's the 40s. Maybe it's even the early 50s. And women weren't sitting on juries. On the whole, even though women had to vote by then, and usually the jury role was taken from the voting roll. But women, what usually happened actually by the 1960s, the rule was any woman could just be excused automatically, or maybe a woman had to actually, in some states, had to actually volunteer to sit on juries. And why would that be? Well, the law wasn't crazy; it just assumed women probably had child care responsibilities or home care responsibilities, and so so you wouldn't. That was really important. So you wouldn't want to interfere with that by making them sit on a jury and listen to all sorts of terrible things that criminals may or may not have done, or accused criminals may or may not. You see what I'm saying? And then what happens is the court says, well, no, actually, I think it was a divided opinion. Hoyt v. Florida is the case. And I think they say, no, you've got to, they don't say you can't exclude women. I'm sorry, they don't say you can't excuse women from jury service because of other duties, but they do say you can't presume that women won't serve on juries. You've got to presume equally. And then there's a case that comes, another case around that time where the court actually allows a distinction. It had to do with serving alcohol at a family restaurant. And there was an age limit you had to be, but the girls could be younger than the men or something like that. And in any event, 1971, the court decides, this is a case out of Idaho, and it says, this is more detailed than you want this. Anyway, it's a case out of Idaho, and it says that when the courts won't presume when there's a situation, someone who dies intestate, that is to say, without a will, they won't assume that when two relatives are equally close, that the male will be the executor of the will rather than the female. Because the law used to presume that, not crazy, because of coverture, it was assumed men probably had men did on the whole have much more experience with business. So the presumption would just be, you don't know which, you just, okay, the man is the one presumed. But the court struck that down at that time. It's called Reed v. Reed. It had the case that involved, I guess, a kid who died and the parents were divorced. And so the question is, which parent is executor of the will? And the law would have said, well, the father. But the woman sued, and it was said it had to be equal. And then by the mid-70s, Brennan is deciding a case that involved veterans benefit, well, not veterans benefits, it was spousal benefits for members of the military. And the deal was that there was a certain benefit that all military wives got. But there were some women in the military at that point, and if a husband wanted those benefits, he had to make a special application for it. Because the presumption was that in most families, the husband is the one who's the member of the military, the wife is the accompanying spouse. But if it were different, then you had to prove that it was different. You know, no slacker guys allowed to just sort of come on. And Brennan would have struck that down. But I guess, actually, I think the whole court struck it down, but Brennan would have done so by saying there's a presumption in any time the law distinguishes between men and women, presume it's unconstitutional, unless it's sort of a compelling purpose, and the court as a whole doesn't go. So does that answer?
So,
I mean, it's more than an answer, but what Brennan, see, that's and why, right, here's your point. Why would that change? We don't write all of that on the exam if you have to, that's much too long, but the point is this, our understanding of equality, Brennan would say, our understanding of equality of the sexes has changed. And it was partly, I mean, registered by a constitutional amendment, the 20th, but this is a question of what's going on in society. And there have been big changes in society, and the court should be able to understand that in understanding the meaning of equal protection. We shouldn't be bound to thinking about equal protection, in other words, the way it was thought about when the clause was written in 1868. So that's the argument behind what Brennan says. So now you see a little more, I think, why he would say something like that, or why it doesn't seem crazy to say that. But Whittington says, look, the logic of it is, and here's the point, there was a proposal to amend the Constitution to say equality of rights under the law shall not be denied on the basis of sex. That is to say, it would have struck down any differentiation in the law between the sex. That was called the Equal Rights Amendment. It was proposed, it was even passed by Congress, but it was not ratified by the states. There was a movement led by a woman, Phyllis Schlafly was her name, that convinced enough states not to ratify it on the grounds that it might call into question the ability even to set up separate bathrooms for men and women, that it might abilities, different differentiation in military service, right? The guys have to register for the draft, women never had to register for the draft, and things like that, if this were passed. And so that was not ratified as a change to the Constitution. What Whittington would say is, Brennan is trying to change the Constitution without this without amendment. And in fact, when the amendment is proposed, it's not accepted. It's not voted in. You see, so that's where the argument is, and that's probably the best illustration I could think of. Sorry for the extra detail. You have a question about?
Basically, a blanket argument is the fact that the Constitution is also inevitably things like gender issues, things like that.
That's a nice way to put it. Yeah, the Constitution's old, and so the question is, can judges? I guess the question is, can judges decide how society has changed, what everybody thinks has changed in the sort of the custom and the understanding of society? Or do the people in a formal process have to change the Constitution if they want something adjusted? Right? I mean, I think most of the originalists, that's the other point of view, most of the originalists would say, you know, the Constitution is just about political life. It doesn't go into every detail about how to live. So, you know, let the legislature work out those details in relation to society. Society in okay, here's an example. 1964, before these cases came up in the Supreme Court, in 1964, when the Civil Rights Act was passed, prohibiting discrimination in employment and education on the basis of race, Congress added, this was actually an amendment that was added to the bill. This was a statute, not the Constitution, but a statute to prohibit discrimination also on the basis of sex. It's a funny story because it was the most conservative Virginian in Congress who proposed that amendment. he thought it would defeat the Civil Rights Act if the amendment got passed, because he was a supporter of the old racial segregation. And boy, did he misjudge, because in fact, it got a lot more women on board for the Civil Rights Act. And as a consequence, the law had to change. So when I was a kid, did I say this in lecture? I don't think I did this year. When I was a kid, if you look at help wanted ads, there would be two separate columns: help wanted men, help wanted women. And after the Civil Rights Act of 64, well, actually, it took several years, because I'm 64, I knew how to read, but I probably wouldn't have been reading help ads. But I sort of noticed them a few years after, and they were still doing it. But 65, 66, eventually people realized, well, wait, the meaning of this is it's just help wanted, right? And people don't, you can't advertise under the law now for a job just for men and just for women. Now, you can put in neutral qualifications. You have to be able to handle this much weight or lift this much weight if it's a job of that sort. And now, gosh, when we list any job at LSU, we got to check off a whole list of, does this require this sort of physical activity or that or whatnot? But that's a story. And I think what Whittington would say is, look, you can change these things by statute. What do we have? We've got a hand up online. Let me take the question online. Is that Danny? Yes, go ahead.
No, yeah, this is Danny. She had a question.
Oh, okay.
When determining a sovereign, what are the factors that people use to pick said sovereign? I've just been wondering that.
This is Hobbes. In Hobbes, who is the sovereign, right?
Yes.
So in Hobbes, the sovereign is, here's the thing, he doesn't give you a list of the factors, right? And the reason, except this, the sovereign is the one who has enough power to protect everybody. And really, that's it. He doesn't want to say anything more, because, see, then people would say, well, he's not really a sovereign because he doesn't have whatever other, if you made a list of 5 or 6 characteristics, people would start arguing about who's the sovereign, right? Or who deserves to be sovereign. And that's precisely what Hobbes wants to stop. He doesn't want those kind of arguments.
Yes,
He says if you want to get out of the state of nature, you got to stop arguments like that.
I'm looking at it.
So somebody, could you make sure if you're not speaking that you're muted, because we've got some background noise here from somewhere. So that's where that's what he wants to say. The sovereign is simply the one who has enough power to protect everybody. So in a way, in practice, he realizes, who are you going to pick to be sovereign? Whoever's the most powerful guy. But then the sovereign is presumably that most powerful guy. This is Hobbes's trust, is going to be more reasonable, because now he doesn't have to worry about anyone trying to take his power. Right? Now, Locke says you can't trust that. The most powerful guy might be much more dangerous to you than all sorts of people who might come from any direction, but none of them being too strong. And that's why Locke lays out an argument in favor of what he calls the appeal to heaven, but which he means is a right of revolution, to overturn a government that is threatening your life and liberty, and especially your property. Does that answer the question? That'll work? Okay.
Yes, thank you.
Good. Okay, good question. Yes.
Specific. That's why, will we be something like take care or just explain?
No, it's just going to be an identification. On the final exam, there'll be a comparative question. But on this exam, it's just going to be an identification. So I gave an example, federalism or something like that. So you would say that's discussed extensively in the Federalist Papers by Publius. It's a form of government in which there are independent states which come together and form a confederation among themselves, but remain sovereign and simply gather in a central place. That's federalism, strictly speaking. And then you might add, what's the significance? The American Constitution is partly federal and partly national. Yes, that's it. Yes, the four kinds of law in Aquinas. Okay. So the four kinds of law in Aquinas are eternal law, natural law, human law, and divine law. Eternal law is the order of things in the mind of God. So that's the whole picture of the way the universe works. And the way, right, beings come to life and die, and the way they thrive and suffer. I mean, that's all in eternal law. Natural law is the eternal law such as it applies to human beings. And we're different because we can understand in that way this part of God's law. We can understand what God intends for us, or we can understand what makes us happy, right? That's really what it is. We can understand our natures, and we can understand what fulfills our natures. And that's what natural law is. It's what reason tells us we need to do in order to pursue what's good, meaning what's going to make us happy. And reason tells us we'll be happy if we're preserved, we have, and therefore have the means to preserve our lives. If we unite with a member of the opposite sex and then bring up the children who result from that union. And if we seek to know God and to live in society with others, because as human beings, we desire to know. We desire to know all things, and that means especially the highest thing and everything else in relation. So that's natural. Now, human law is ordinary law that's made by government, right? And that's going to derive from natural law, because a human law that doesn't try to make people happy, to adjust to the common good of people, is going to be tyrannical and unjust. And an unjust law is not a law, according to Aquinas. And he knows some so-called human laws might be unjust, but a real human law is either an application of natural law in detail, in some detail, right? Because what I said was pretty general. But, you know, if you're going to have human laws about marriage, you've got to determine, say, do people need their parents' consent to marry? At what age do they need consent, and what age can they marry on their own, right? Do they have to both be citizens of the state in order to marry one another, or can you marry a foreigner? All these things are worked out in human law, and he knows that some of that you can just deduce, right? So you can know, if you reflect on human happiness, that it probably is true that there should be some age after which people should be able to marry on their own choice because they're mature enough to make that choice. But you can also know that since sexual desire tends to arise in people before the full formation of reason, that there could be instances where a marriage would be appropriate, but it would require the guidance of the parents. So you can see that sort of a logic to that. You could kind of deduce that there ought to be an age, that marriage ought to be by consent, and it ought to be after a certain age, just the parties' consent is sufficient. I think Aquinas would say natural. But to tell you exactly what the age is, you know, that's probably different in society, right? It's in some ways in our modern urban society, it's not an issue because nobody wants to marry before they're 18 or before they're mature. In Arkansas, things are a little different. So can I make a joke about Arkansas? Is that all right? So they would say in Louisiana, up north, but you ever seen the movie? There was a movie about Jerry Lee Lewis, right? And I think he marries when a girl who's 15 or 14 or something.
Yeah, that was also the second, first or second cousin.
Well, okay, so the cousin question's an interesting question. Well, no, because I mean, it seems to be natural law in the sense that every society except one, or almost one, prohibits brothers and sisters from marriage. But what degree of cousins? You know, you shake it far enough, and we're all cousins. You know, what degree would it have to be? And societies have differed on that. Some allow first cousins, some you have to be second cousins. Some define first cousin or second cousin differently. You know, in Seattle we do it differently than the Commonwealth states. And so these things are, see, these are settled by human law. So human law is partly deducing from natural law, and partly, Aquinas says, a matter of determination. You know, first cousin or second cousin probably depends on the society on whether or not, you know, how many people are available. You know, is it, are you in an urban place where there are plenty of other possibilities? And maybe it also depends on whether the society is really organized around the clan or the family, where there really is pressure to keep things within the family, and so forth. So Aquinas would allow some differentiation between societies on that, I think. Now, I had left out divine law. What is divine law? Well, divine law are the revealed commandments of God. So divine law is essentially the 10 Commandments. Now, it turns out that those commandments are pretty similar to natural law in a lot of respects, right? So they teach you, don't murder, don't steal, don't commit adultery, etc. So at some level, they repeat natural law, but Aquinas gives the reasons why God had to give divine law too, because people don't always reason right. There are some things that are wrong, even though you could never judge it by natural law. So it's wrong to covet your neighbor's wife or your neighbor's spouse, right? Because the wrong desire is apt to lead to the wrong action, and it's just forming you the wrong way. But you can't make a law about that, because you couldn't enforce it in a way that wouldn't require sort of torturing people to, you looked at her, you know, and I know what you were thinking. Well, how are you going to do that and have a decent system of law, right? So God can see, you see, Aquinas says. So that's why the commandments are added on, says Aquinas. Right? Or as I like to say about the adultery commandment, you know, people can reason themselves into why it's okay this time. And so God just made it clear. No. Now, actually, interestingly, Aristotle says the same thing. No, never. Adultery is just wrong here. But so that's where that is. So it's kind of like a human law, but God made it. And but it's actually kind of like natural law, but God said it, so it's, or said it through Moses, and so it's got a kind of certainty that human law doesn't. Does that make sense? Does that cover the 4 things? Okay, there's another question online. Go ahead. Krisha Wandalin? Are you there? There.
Yes,
Okay.
sir. Thank you. Okay. My question is, since the essay terms could come from any author we read, should we focus more on ancient foundations like Aristotle and Aquinas, or more on the modern constitutional writers like Brennan? Like, which ones do you think we should focus more on, or would be on the test?
Okay. I tend to try to be really even in the questions I ask in relation to the classes. So if you noticed on the quiz question, the 20 quiz questions, you've had what? How many? This is quiz 28 today, and you went up to what, 13 on the, so you've got 15 quizzes, I think, for this, 20 questions. So there'll be one question from every quiz and 2 questions from every third quiz, right? So that's going to be kind of even. On the essay question, there's going to be 2 IDs from the first principle section and 2 IDs from the constitutional section, right? Now, how many do you have to write about? One, right? I mean, that's why I don't cut a lot of slack if you get that one wrong, because you had four to choose from. You should know all four of them, but pick the one you know best. So, if you don't want to write on Aristotle, you don't have to write on Aristotle, but you better know something about what's in that other material. And what am I going to choose from that material? Well, you could be pretty sure, right? In the first principles section, we spent a week on Aristotle and a week on everybody else. So probably there'll be one ID from Aristotle and one from somebody else, right? And in the other section, we spent about a week on the Federalist and about a week on other topics. So there's probably going to be one from the Federalist and one from, you see what I mean about being even in this? So if you know the Federalist inside out, you can gamble and just say, whatever one comes from the Federalist, I'm going to recognize it and know it. Or if you know your Aristotle inside out, then that's the key thing. So it's a different strategy in studying. But probably the best thing to do is make sure you know something about everything, because you're going to have to do that anyway to answer the multiple choice questions. But pick a couple terms from, pick terms from different places, but you don't have to pick from every place. Just, if you want to get everything from Aristotle and everything from the Federalist Papers, I guarantee you'll be all right. Right? I'm not going to give you things from, lots of little things from different places. But I could pick a term that's just from a single class. I'd have to in those last ones because we just have a topic each day. Good. Yes. Okay.
I guess when it's okay, I know
Good.
from what I've read, it's kind of like whatever he said that he that in the field of arms, and you kind of gotta let God decide. I kind of read that as in like Thomas Handbook. I don't really know. So,
Yeah, I think it's not quite. I mean, the appeal to heaven isn't an appeal to arms, and the people will be the judge of when to make that appeal, he says. But he also says, when is it legitimate? And there he's very clear. Either there's been a change to the Constitution, that is to say, an unauthorized change to the Constitution. In other words, the government's acting unconstitutional, or they're taking away the rights of property. And so if there's a violation of the constitutional order, and in particular of the legislative power, so if the executive, if the king takes away the legislative power, dissolves parliament, doesn't allow them to meet when they're supposed to meet, that would presumably be a justification. And if you look at the Declaration of Independence, you'll see that one of the charges against the king is precisely that he's dissolved legislative powers and forget in some of the colonial assemblies and forbade them to meet. But also there's the substantive concern. That's sort of a procedural concern, right? If he changes the process of government. But if they violate the substantive right of protection of property, right, then you can, then the government is betraying its trust because you establish government to protect your property. Oh, okay, yeah. Hope that's what you learned in the other class too, right?
External reason, is that kind of related there? Like,
This is law?
I think so, for like reasons. External reasons.
Well, if by external and internal you mean, I think those are both external in the sense that they're objective facts that people could see. Now, he also says people aren't apt to revolt just at one little instance of injustice here or one there, because Locke, as much as Aristotle, realizes that the world is imperfect, or that there's a lot of imperfection. But, so if that's the distinction, okay, now he also says governments can be dissolved from outside, meaning a foreign power could conquer them. And that might be what you're thinking of. And that refers to chapters we didn't even read in this course. And that gets that's the chapter on conquest. And so that makes things a little more complicated because, you don't automatically have to consent to a government that conquers you've consented to a government, but if that government is conquered by an outside power, you don't automatically have to consent to them. That's a fresh consent you'd have to give to the concrete pact. And that's probably what you're thinking of at the external, internal. And that, would be Lagniappe in this course.
I really kind of struggled on the section where we were going through Aristotle's politics, and I just kind of wanted to ask a broad question about what were Aristotle's key ideas in politics?
The key idea is the constitution or the regime. That every city, every polity, every city has a polity, that is to say a constitution, a politeia, some sort of order of who rules. And that order reflects people's idea of what is just. And it's also going to determine for that city what counts as justice. It's going to make the laws for that city. And he says it isn't just that there are, 1,000 different kinds of regimes. There are basically 6. And that is to say you can analyze different cities and see that there are 6 basic kinds of constitution, ruled by one, few, and many, or many. It's one of those. And either they rule for the common good or just for their own advantage as rulers. And so there's that chart that I have on, and you want to know that chart. The chart makes sense of what those 6 regimes are. And right, so you should be able to recognize that rule by one for the common good is kingship, rule by one for his own advantage only is tyranny. Rule by a few for the common good is aristocracy, by a few only for themselves is oligarchy, etc. Right? So that in a way is the key idea. Now he's going to ask, what's the best regime among those? And there the answer is, well, it has to be in the column of good regimes, right? It's got to be ruling for the common good. And there it seems it's either going to be a kingship or an aristocracy, because he says about the polity, it's for the common good, but not as refined a character of virtue, because the many aren't capable of the finest virtue. They can be law-abiding and they can be courageous at war, but you won't get all the refinement of that you could find in a great aristocracy or in a great king. And whether it's a king or an aristocracy seems to depend on just the facts of the case. Do you have one person of really outstanding virtue, or do you have a whole group of outstanding virtue? But see, that all comes out of the charts. So that's, as I'm saying. Now, which regime, you'll see if you look at the charters, click through the slides in the chart, you'll see that each regime has something that it looks up to, a way that it defines justice, really, right? And so an oligarchy looks up to wealth. That's how they decide who's a ruler. If you have enough, if you're wealthy, right? And that's what they look up to. That's what they think is most important in society. A democracy looks up to freedom, just capacity of people to make their own decisions about their lives. The good regimes all look up to virtue, but it seems he does suggest there's a kind of gradation of virtue between how refined the virtue is. Okay, so that's the key idea, is distinguishing the kinds of regimes. Now, you say that doesn't say anything about slavery or any of that. That's right, because that's all sort of pre-political for Aristotle. The regime presumes that households are organized and economic life is organized, as it were, as a precondition for politics, even though wealth and poverty matter in politics. Yes. Yes, because what he makes this distinction between democracy and polity. And it's fine to go, because I know people have this just a review session. So I told people they can come late, they can leave early. So he makes a distinction between polity and democracy. Polity, ruled by many for the common good. Democracy, ruled by many only for the good of the rulers. So what he means is the majority is only, what he means by democracy is what Madison means by majority faction. It's just a majority that doesn't care about the rights of others and even about the common good, the permanent and aggregate interests of the whole community. Right? It's just us as a majority. So that's why he says it's actually a bet, even though it's one of the bad regimes is better than an oligarch. But still, it's not everybody, because that majority is willing to take away the property of the rich. And he thinks it's a better arrangement to keep the rich from exploiting the poor and keep the poor from invading the rich. And what you want is the balance of a mixed regime. That's better than either of them. The balance of a mixed regime where the poor aren't exploited, but they don't try to raid the coffers of the rich. And the rich have their property secure, but they don't try to exploit the poor to gather even more. Right. So there's a kind of balance there, even though you have although the balance is going to work best, he says, if there's a large middle class. That is to say, people who aren't so poor that they're always on the edge of poverty, right? I mean, a middle class would be people who own something. Maybe they own their own home or are buying their own, have a mortgage on their home or something like that. They've got some debt, but it's not the kind of crushing debt where they're desperate and about to feel they're going to lose everything. They don't feel poor that way. They feel they have something, but they don't feel they have so much they can exploit other people, right? Yeah, the middle class, that's a middle class. He talks about that, he defines it. And one of his accounts of the polity is to say it's where the majority is actually in the middle class. Because he says it's going to be hard to have a polity or mixed regime if you have only the extremes of rich and poor. But it'll be a lot easier if you've got a kind of gradation. He knows they'll be rich, they'll be poor, but there's also a substantial middle class. And they can sometimes, presumably because they can sometimes vote with the rich to protect property and then sometimes vote with the poor to stop exploitation. We put it that way. So you had another question or no? Oh. Anybody else? Anybody else online? We've had a couple from online. Had a lot of good questions today. What else? Yes.
How does that relate to Aristotle's?
Well, Hobbes's sovereign has to be one body, but it doesn't have to be one person. So it's either a body, not as a human body, but one assembly. So you could have one assembly. So there could be a state in which the Senate is sovereign. There's a Senate and it's sovereign. It's a group of aristocrats, right? In fact, the aristocracy, Aristotle's aristocracy might be sovereign. But Aristotle's sort of second, the question for Aristotle of who's got the ultimate say is secondary to the question of what does the city stand for? And Aristotle is fine with this mixed regime where some things are in the hands of the rich and some things are in the hands of the poor, and they share power between them. Hobbes would say you got to pick one body that's in charge. He doesn't care about the rich or poor question. He says pick the body, and if they've got sufficient power to protect everybody, they'll be the sovereign. But they better be unified. Now, of course, he knows an assembly is going to debate things and be divided. There'll be votes, but still, as long as they've got a process and they act as a body so that they abide by the votes, they take votes and abide by the votes, he's willing to live with them. And he says you can't prove that the only reasonable sovereignty is a monarchy. And the reason you can't is that monarchs die. Assemblies don't really die. I mean, people in the assemblies die, but you can replace them. The assembly is still there, right? Even if, outside of a catastrophe, but it's still there, even though individual members die. So there's continuity is better in an assembly. But on the whole, assemblies do divide. And what if somebody there decides that division, they can't live with it and they're going to actually start fighting? Or what if you have a rule in the assembly? He would never allow a rule in the assembly that could let it come to a stalemate. Then it's not a sovereign. because it can't make decisions. A sovereign has to be able to make decisions and act. Yes. Competitive authoritarianism, right, what we talked about on Monday. So competitive authoritarianism is a sort of in-between regime in a modern analysis, a bit different from Aristotle's, which says the key different kinds of regimes are democracies on the one hand and authoritarian regimes on the other. Democracies, and he would include liberal democracies, I mean, constitutional democracies, but maybe any regime in which the majority ultimately rules could have separation of power, whatever, separation of powers, constitution. In fact, he sort of supposes that in his definition of democracy. Probably his definition of democracy is closer to Aristotle's polity, because he said it includes the rule of law, right? And therefore certain stability, certain justice, and protection of rights. On the one hand, and then a regime where there's a single dictator or maybe a military group or collection of people who rule the regime without any elections that matter. They might go through the form of elections, but there's only one person on the ballot, so that's not really an election. And he says there is this regime in between the two. And that's the competitive authoritarianism. It's an authoritarian regime in that the ultimate power seems to be in the military ruler or the dictator, but there are actual competitive elections. And the dictator is not such that he's able to or even tries to suppress all opposition. So typically he has one party that's more friendly to him and maybe another party that's critical, but he allows real elections where people do have a choice. And he says there are just a lot of states that are kind of like this. He grants it's a kind of in-between stage. It might be in between in the sense that it's an authoritarian regime that is moving to democracy. And it moves to democracy by allowing elections first and an elected parliament. And then eventually maybe the old dictator dies and now they'll elect a leader for a presidential term and not a president for life. Or it might be the other way. That's the one he's particularly concerned about when he's talking about the new competitive authoritarianism. Regimes that have been democracies, but one party has won and is consolidating power in such a way that it's starting to make the other party nervous that they'll actually have free elections afterwards. And that that the elections really will be free and competitive. Or that the judges will be neutral and aren't just tools of the authoritarian power. Right. So his claim is that if you look at Turkey or you look at Hungary, they were simply democracies 20 years ago, but now they've moved in a way that it seems the ruler is trying to set things up so his party never loses again. I mean, sets things up not just by making the party popular, but by somehow fiddling with the elections, disqualifying candidates, taking over the news media, and things of that sort. So, I mean, interestingly, he suggests, some people say this is what the Republicans are about now with Mr. Trump. But the Republicans say this is what the Democrats were about with Mr. Biden. And both of them accuse the others of fiddling with elections or of dominating the media in some way. And so, so probably if both sides are accusing, it's not as much a problem. I mean, after all, the Democrats won every election yesterday, even though there are only a few states with elections and no federal elections. Nevertheless, they won. So if Mr. Trump is trying to consolidate power in that way, he sure did a bad job. So, yes. The concept of what kind of laws? Aquinas's laws. Okay. Well, on the whole, they seem to have been more familiar with Locke than Aquinas. But they do refer to natural law, right? They say the law of nature and of nature's God. And so you can interpret the Declaration, or people have interpreted the Declaration, as altogether consistent with what Aquinas says. After all, Aquinas says unjust laws are not laws. So that's in a way what the authors of the Declaration are saying, right? They're not legitimate laws, and we can rebel against it. Now they don't spell out; they describe the laws of nature a little differently, right? As based in natural rights, or derivative of natural rights, and those natural rights are rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And while Aquinas would say that with Aristotle, that happiness is the good that people seek by nature. So the basic natural law, he says, is seek the good, right? And that means seek to be happy. In that way, he doesn't spell it out in quite the same way. But it's not inconsistent. Life is the first precept of natural law according to Aquinas is preserve life. So that seems perfectly consistent. Now, the Declaration doesn't say anything much about family, right? And or anything of that sort. So that seems a little different. Aquinas mentions that, stresses that as a part of natural law. Declaration speaks as if the rights are individual rights. Although later on, sort of in passing, when they complain about the Native Americans and their rule of warfare, they say which pays no attention to ages and conditions and sex. That's the only mention of sex in the Declaration. But that implies that they have certain assumptions about what are the right order of relations between the sexes. And not to mention that they would agree with Walzer that non-combatants shouldn't be destroyed in war. So I think that the connection could be forged, but it's not completely obvious. In the Federalist Papers. Well, okay, so if you want recap, what did I say in general about it? So the Federalist Papers are written to advocate the ratification of the Constitution. Ratification by the Constitution, by Article 7 of the Constitution, is left up to conventions in the states. So even though the Constitution is designed by a convention in Philadelphia, meeting in the summer of 1787, they design it and they write it. But that doesn't make it law yet. All they do is they send it to the states and say, if you agree, then it can become the law if 9 of you agree among yourselves, 9 of you states, or 9 of you conventions in the states. They don't send it to the state governments. They send it to conventions, specially called for that purpose. Elected, that means elected for that purpose within the states. And so now it has to be argued out. And there were arguments in each of these conventions. Most of the conventions ratified the Constitution. But one of them turned it down, North Carolina, because it didn't have a Bill of Rights. They later call another convention and ratify it after Madison has introduced the Bill of Rights in the first Congress. Sent them out to the states for ratifying. Now they say, okay, we can ratify, we can buy it now because it's got these amendments. So does that answer what you were asking about? Okay. Anything else? Yeah. Well, okay. So Hobbes says the natural condition of man is the war of all against all, right? And it's horrible, and everybody agrees it's horrible. So The key is to get out of the state of nature. How do you do that? Everyone makes a contract with everyone else to agree to recognize someone as sovereign. And when they've done that, they have a single power, because everybody's going to recognize them, who will protect them. And at that point, it's safe to follow natural law. See, natural law didn't oblige you yet because it wasn't safe to obey it. Okay, so that's the basics of things. State of nature, contract, sovereign. Anything else? Been going for a full hour. You've had lots of questions this time. I'm impressed. Anything else? Anything online? No, a lot of people left. Okay, well, good luck, and we'll end the recording there.